Okay, good morning to everyone. Just going to give you a few seconds because I can see that we've got a number of people joining us as we speak. So we'll just get started in a second. Okay, right. Well, welcome to session 2 of the webinar on a circular approach to procurement. Welcome to those that joined us from yesterday, having done the session yesterday, and welcome to anyone who didn't attend yesterday and attending for the first time. Hopefully you'll find this useful. We're focusing today on a bit more of the practical stuff when it comes to developing a specification regarding a circular approach to procurement. It'll be myself and Mervyn Jones again, and Speller is in the background supporting us. Before we go on, just to remind you that this is part of the Interreg European programme, the EU programme, providing support and establishing collaboration across the North Sea region. I'm not going to go into that great detail now. We spoke about that yesterday. If you want more information on this, you can find this out from the Interreg website. Details are provided later on. Otherwise, let's crack on with what we're planning to do today. So yesterday, to remind those and to tell those that are joining us from afresh, we introduced the circular approach to procurement. We talked about what that meant, what the term circular procurement meant, trying to demystify it, trying to identify the benefits from applying a circular approach, trying to make sure that the link to or the fact that it is part of an extension to sustainable procurement is clear. And some key tips. We introduced the hierarchy, which you'll be familiar with when it comes to things like the waste hierarchy, and we'll be revisiting that in a minute. So today, having looked at the conceptual stuff yesterday, we'll be focusing more on a bit more practical. Okay, we only have 2 hours, so we're not necessarily going to end up with a model tender specification or tender document by the end of today, but we will be looking at some examples. We'll be going through those. We'll be having some polls again. We'll be having some discussion at the end. And again, I'd encourage you to, if you have any questions or comments, please put them on the chat function, which you'll find. Hopefully you're familiar with that, but please put them on the chat and we will be monitoring them as we go along. And we'll be setting aside sufficient time at the end of today to be able to answer questions and to have a discussion, so we can hopefully leave you with some positive thoughts and positive actions to take away. So we're going to be talking about practical implementation, developing a specification, how that links into obviously contract management, e.g. KPIs, and building in some examples, bringing some examples from the UK, Scotland and elsewhere that are potentially useful. Okay, so that's reinforced there. And yesterday we had a bit of a discussion and a poll about stakeholders and who's important in this process or the consideration of a circular approach to procurement. And again, we're reinforcing this point about it's not just any of you guys who are involved in actually undertaking the procurement process. An important element, an important stage to be able to consider the opportunities and the benefits that apply and could arise from applying a circular approach to procurement. That needs to take place as early as you possibly can, and therefore needs to involve relevant stakeholders, commissioners, specifiers, budget holders, heads of planning, whoever it may be, so that you're giving yourself the opportunity to identify and capture the opportunities that are available from this approach. So the learning outcomes yesterday, as I've discussed, were focusing mainly on the conceptual stuff. What is circular procurement? What are the benefits? What are the key principles? And today We're moving on to how to apply it. Again, we touched on the hierarchy yesterday. We'll be talking about that. The importance of early consideration, can't stress that enough, with stakeholders and of course the market, and some examples of that. And then we'll be talking about developing a specification. We'll be using one or two examples. We'll be bringing in some example clauses that may or may not be relevant for the future, but have been used in relevant tenders, relevant contracts and frameworks. And obviously there are, a lot has already been done in this space, circularity and procurement. And there are a lot of examples out there, and sometimes that can be an issue in itself because you need to understand what's relevant to the contract in question. So we'll be trying to give you some pointers on that in the time we've got available. And we also need to spend a bit of time thinking about the role of monitoring and reporting, the role of contract management in that, making sure that we understand how to identify the outcomes that are being delivered through this approach. So what are relevant KPIs? What should we be talking to the supplier about? Is there an opportunity for continual improvement with that supplier? And how does that tie in with monitoring and reporting requirements we may have internally or indeed externally? So this is the agenda for today. I'll be talking a bit about the hierarchy and applying that in practice, and then tenders and specifications, contract management, and then, as I said, a bit of a session at the end on questions and discussion. Okay, so we introduced yesterday the hierarchy, and we need to revisit this. We need to remind ourselves about this in the context of making sure that we apply the principles that support a circular approach to procurement as early as possible. Now, this is in the context of trying to plan ahead. There are sometimes some organizations who've undertaken or adopted a circular approach have addressed some of the problems that they've had initially, and that is perhaps the confidence that people have to be able to challenge perhaps what has happened in the past, what the traditional approach has been in the past. And that needs to reflect, therefore, your organization's policy, organization ambitions. Is it clear what the circular economy can do and a circular approach to procurement can do for the organization, for economy, for society, for environment, for the university, for the college and your community? And how is that reflected in your internal ambitions, your internal buy-in? Do you have support at the top? Do you have support where necessary? And is it clear what need, what function is actually required? Does that need or function mean that you have to buy things in the same old way, the traditional way? You buy a commodity, or are there alternatives that we should perhaps be considering, which is one of the approaches to circularity and procurement. Is it clear what the intended outcomes are? What are the intended outcomes? What are the intended benefits? What are we aiming for? Are we aiming for just to be able to secure the products that we want, or are we actually looking for energy efficiency? Are we looking for as little waste as possible? Are we trying to support our ambitions regarding net zero and reduce it, and how we address the climate emergency? Are we looking for local economic development as well through jobs, skills and training? And also the link, of course, to graduates and work placements, work experience within universities and colleges. Are all those relevant to those intended outcomes? Do we understand the impacts? We hopefully emphasized yesterday that one of the important principles when it comes to considering circularity in procurement, a circular approach to procurement, is applying this to the whole life cycle, understanding the life cycle of what it is that you think you may need. Is it a product? Is it commodity? Is it a service? Is it a construction project? Whatever it may be. Do we understand the full life cycle? Are we thinking about the source phase, the use phase, and its end of life, deconstruction, whatever it may be, phase as well. So do we understand all the impacts? And do we understand all the relevant costs? Are we doing life cycle costing appropriately so that we understand where the costs may arise, whether it's now or in the future, and whose budget they are? It may be somebody else's budget, and as Mervyn said yesterday, in some cases, these costs may not apply for some time, but they will apply potentially. So we need to factor those in when we're thinking about the optimum solution that we're seeking, which may include a circular approach. So that brings us on to options. What options are there? There are various options. They relate to business models potentially, which we'll be touching on. And also, of course, we need to understand market capability and capacity. Do we know the maturity of the market regarding circular approaches? Have we engaged with the market? Do we need to engage further with the market to understand what the art of the possible is, or to provide a clear message to the market that this is an approach that we are supportive of, we're interested in, and we need them to support? Okay, so just going back to the hierarchy which we saw yesterday. And if you remember, we had the 5 levels, we think in the need at the first. Okay, so of course, the most sustainable approach to procurement is not to buy anything at all. We need to address the procurement need, perhaps by making use of existing products, materials, or assets already purchased or available. I'm not going to repeat all of this. We went through it yesterday, but some of you may be joining us for the first time. So it's worth touching on the principles again. Now, to be able to apply the hierarchy in practice, we need to have a grown-up conversation with the right stakeholders early as we possibly can. And that is understanding who the internal stakeholders are. It's understanding what the key issues we need to tease out. Do we understand what our, as we just said in the previous slide, do we understand what our need or our required function is? Do we understand what our intended outcomes are? Do we understand how those can be best delivered? Or do we actually think there's a better way of doing that? Do we need to find out whether there's a better way of doing that? And the first stage in that process is saying, well, actually, we may not need to buy. So we need to look at the opportunity for using existing products, materials, or assets, which may be already available somewhere in your organization, for example. Do you have systems in place to share resources? Is there opportunity for further collaboration across the education sector, for example, for sharing and reusing resources which don't need any repair or renovation, if there are surplus in parts of that sector? Otherwise, reduce. Again, Mervyn went through the hierarchy yesterday. Can we refurbish, repair existing products rather than buying brand new? There's the opportunity there potentially. That leads to possible discussions with the market about the services that may be available to be able to repair, refurbish products, equipment, etc. And again, can we satisfy needs making use of existing, reused, or refurbished products? Okay, so we've been through all of these hierarchy tiers yesterday, and I'm not going to spend too much more talking about this now, but we need to be clear whether these opportunities, and I think you need to think about these as opportunities, present themselves for what it is that you may be thinking about buying. Okay, so use the hierarchy, and to do that, we need to make sure that we are talking to the right stakeholders, as I've just said. Ultimately, as we said yesterday, this is about reducing the use of virgin materials. It's about reducing carbon, reducing emissions. It's about reducing waste. It's about saving money. It's about generating jobs, skills, training opportunities for the local economy, and therefore potentially enhancing the resilience of whatever it is that we feel that we may need. while encouraging and enabling innovative solutions. So the more you think about this, the earlier. Okay, the earlier the better. So yesterday we spoke about stakeholders, the importance of stakeholders. One of the lessons and one of the challenges sometimes can be the issue about challenging in a positive way an approach, a historic or a traditional approach, and applying a circular approach to procurement does involve thinking about how you can best deliver the intended outcomes as early as you possibly can. And that may well be challenging a traditional approach. That may well be having some sometimes difficult conversations with internal stakeholders to understand what the art of the possible is, to understand what the best outcome or the optimum solution is likely to be. But you need to have those conversations to take a more strategic approach to procurement, if you like. And obviously that reflects the approach which Scotland and the Scottish Government has taken for a number of years. The Procurement Reform Act reinforces that. So it's not just, procurement is not just at the end of the pipe being told what to do. It has to be, the procurement function has to be involved early enough, and you need to have those mature dialogue, if you like, with internal and external stakeholders. Excuse me. One of the things we need to think about is there an opportunity? Should we be thinking about alternatives in terms of business models? I've said that in some cases we need to challenge what we've done in the past. And one of the questions is perhaps if you're buying a product, a commodity, an asset, do you need to own it? Is it absolutely essential that it goes on your asset register? Why do you need to put it on your asset register? Is there a particular reason? Is there a reason you need to own that? Or can the required function be provided in an alternative way? Now, there are various different types of business models. They potentially, some of them talk about ownership remaining with the supplier, and ownership remaining with the supplier therefore means that in theory anyway, the supplier has an incentive to make sure that the products, materials, assets that it's supplying, the function that it's supplying, the useful life is being extended as much as it possibly can be, because they have a financial incentive to do so. You still need to make sure, as we said yesterday, you still need to make sure that these models are actually delivering a circular outcome. But these types of models can be categorized, as this slide shows, in terms of product service systems. So it's rather than buying a commodity or a product necessarily, you are being provided with a service which delivers the functionality you need through delivery of the product. So the ownership, as I say, perhaps is remaining with the supplier, or the product itself is being extended through you're extending the useful life of the product, and you're recovering resources, you're sharing resources and sharing platforms as exist in some parts of Scotland and the UK. And you're also trying to encourage and enable circular supply chains. So you are enabling partnerships, you're also enabling reuse and extending the useful life through various partners within the supply chain. So from a procurement perspective, the main concepts may well be you buy something and then it's resold. You buy and then sell on, or you resell. You buy and resell, you buy, sell, and then there are product service systems. So in simple terms, we think about these things perhaps as some of the business models that exist, of course, would be hire or rental. Lease, is that a circular business model? We discussed this yesterday, potentially, but it depends how the lease model actually runs and whether a circular approach is being applied. there can be various others. So a product as a service, for example, we spoke yesterday about egg lighting and Philips Lighting, which the Dutch company, which I changed their name now, and I forget who they're called now, but Mervyn will remind me, I'm sure. They have been for many years providing lighting as a service. So you just buy the lumens, if you like, the lighting that you need, rather than having to buy all the light fittings and the equipment that you need to go with it. And those types of models are increasingly available. They're available for computers, they're available for furniture, furnishings, they're available, even organizations like Rolls-Royce run them on their engines. Airlines don't own aero engines, they're owned by Rolls-Royce, and you just pay a fee, if you like, for their use. And the same increasingly applies to various products. Now that means that ownership remains with the supplier, the liability remains with the supplier, therefore, for the product, but you are getting the functionality you need. And that obviously has an impact on your financial model, because in the past, if you own a product or equipment or materials, assets, then you are responsible for its purchase price and any ongoing costs, and also any end-of-life costs there may be. With a product service model, or a model where the ownership remains with the supplier, then some of those costs remain with the supplier. They're not yours. The end-of-life costs are not yours. The ongoing maintenance costs of those products or equipment is not yours, unless it's part of a separate service agreement. So to be able to compare one against the other, you need to understand what the difference is in terms of costs and the cost models. So that's an important factor to bring in finance, obviously, to be able to do that. So what I think we would like to do now is just try and get a bit of an understanding from yourselves about the extent to which you are familiar with and you use alternative business models. So where, for example, where ownership remains with the supplier, these types of models that we're showing here. So we've got a short poll. So if we could have that poll up now. You've got a few questions. So what alternative models do you consider or encourage as part of the tendering exercise? Excuse me. And there's a number there. There are others, but this is just trying to highlight some of the key issues. So if you wouldn't mind having a look at that. And I can see that you're doing that as we speak. I'll leave you for a second or two to do that. Okay, I think we should probably, the voting has probably stopped now. So if we end that, thank you very much. Okay, so just looking at the results of that, thanks for taking part. So we've got 71% of you using lease hire models. Okay, there's a difference between leasing and hiring, of course, but obviously you're quite familiar with those, and those are being used very routinely. Product service-based models, again, a fair chunk of you are used to using those. In the education sector, some of that potentially could relate to equipment, even laboratory equipment can be supplied on those types of models, so that may be one of the reasons for that. Take back models, so where products, equipment is taken back at the end of life by the supplier. Again, 40%, but much lower proportion. Sell on or donate models, so what do you do with them at the end of life? Do you pass on to, for example, third sector organizations, social enterprises, or sell on auction equipment products? That's only 33%. And then we have shared models. So not a lot of activity in terms of sharing models, co-sharing assets. That may be something that could be explored further. As I say, there are various other business models that do exist, but it's interesting to see that the majority of yourselves are saying where you use lease and hiring on a regular basis, which is perhaps not surprising. Some of the other business models are maybe not quite so familiar with. They are becoming more and more prevalent and more available. So I think there's an opportunity there to examine those with the market, explore those with the market in due course. Okay, thank you for doing that. So one or two examples. We touched on the NHS and office and other furniture framework yesterday, and I mentioned that there were NHS Scotland had a very ambitious approach regarding circularity. They wanted 25% of the tender weighting related to circularity, and that involved significant market engagement. So what we're trying to emphasize in this section again is the importance of engaging with the market, understanding what the market is capable of, what its capacity is, and this involved a PIN and a survey, a further PIN, and then a supplier engagement event. And that informed the development of the specification and the tender, and ended up with a situation where we had suppliers who were quite mature in this approach and others who were less mature. So there was a need to provide opportunities for development and partnerships. And that's an important element, I think, when it comes to circularity and procurement, is recognizing that parts of the certain sectors of the market are quite mature in this, as Mervyn touched on yesterday, and other sectors are less mature. So you need to give them the chance to develop and collaborate as they go through that. Another example is playground equipment, Scotland Excel framework. And again, that was very much undertaking market research and engagement events with suppliers to understand what the art of the possible was regarding circular approaches to the equipment that was going to be needed. That was looking at materials, recycled content, etc., end of life management, take back of materials, etc., for reuse. And that included engagement with other public bodies to understand what they were doing. So collaboration with public sector, other public sector organizations is an important element in this. And that is one of the three strands when it comes to collaboration, as Mervyn mentioned yesterday. So it's not just about engaging internally with the market, it's also about engaging with other public sector organizations and learning from them. For example, with the playground equipment, that was engaging with the city of Aalborg, which had had some good experience on this. And then circular ICT, there was a recent webinar we delivered looking at this, which some of you may have been involved in. And this was looking at various options that exist regarding repair. How do we extend the useful life of ICD? How do we avoid waste and automatically default to a recycling contract, which may cost us quite a bit to contract? Are there alternatives such as refreshing, upgrading, extending replacement cycles, buying refurbished, or even buying remanufactured? Obviously, you can buy remanufactured laptops nowadays routinely. Are there, again, business models? Is device as a service a useful option to be considered? So there are various options with ICT, and some of that has been reflected in the ICT frameworks, Scottish procurement frameworks we looked at yesterday. One or two other examples. This Public Health Wales. Now, Public Health Wales were had a very enthusiastic, let's put it that way, approach to this, in that they wanted to look for opportunities to reuse. And this was looking at the rationalisation of the estate and the need to, which is obviously something we're considering at the moment in certain parts of the public sector in Scotland. And it was looking at using existing furniture where possible, trying to avoid procurement of brand new furniture, trying to also encourage and enable opportunities for third sector organisations, and to provide a working environment which the staff valued and improved health and well-being as well. And this was all part of the Welsh Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So that it was an important approach to, and there were lots of outcomes that came from this, which we're not going to spend time looking at now. But again, part of this was a PIN, having an engagement event with about 30 suppliers to find out what the suppliers could do. With a positive response, all the suppliers said, yeah, we can do this, no problem. Up until that point, there was no real understanding what the market can do. So in a lot of cases, the market can provide a lot more than perhaps we think we can ask of them. So we need to have that dialogue to understand. Similarly, Aberdeenshire Council, similar sort of thing on their space strategy, engagement with the market, trying to understand what the opportunities are for reducing environmental impact through reuse and a more circular approach. Quite a lot of engagement with Aberdeenshire on that. A Dutch example, this was looking at the need for a new bridge, and the approach taken was, let's look for a modular approach, let's look for something where you can design for disassembly, let's look for fewer materials, we'll include materials passports so we can understand going forward what the assets are, what the materials included are, so that if there's an opportunity to reuse them, or we understand what the opportunity is for reusing them in the future, because we understand what their assets are, what those materials are included, what the assets are made of. So this was an interesting one because there was a lot of engagement again to try and understand, starting off on the basis what your intended outcomes are, reduce materials used, reduce waste, minimize disruption, and how this could be done in the best way. So the approach involved a lot of internal discussion, a lot of engagement with the market, and this is what we're trying to reinforce at this point. To deliver the best outcomes, you need to have that dialogue early. Transport for London, another one. Now this was very much a focus on innovation. Okay, it's about the tube and rail, and not necessarily particularly directly relevant to the education sector, but I think the important thing is about innovation. And again, that links in very much, as we said yesterday, to circularity. So this was an approach by saying to the market, okay, we're going to operate a sustainable innovation workshop. We need to understand internally and externally what the possibility is to improve, to reduce the use of materials, to improve the delivery of this tunnelling that needs to take place as part of the Northern Line extension. And how could we do that? And the outcomes arising from this resulted in the tunnel's thickness being reduced quite significantly, still of course safe, and the tunnel lining being reduced. And you'll see there was a clear quantifying of those outcomes in terms of carbon reduction. So the use of material, so the amount of material reduced, resulting in significant thousands of tons of saving being reduced as well. So an overall about 60% carbon emissions. Now that was only possible through that innovation workshop to try and work out what was possible, to have a grown-up again dialogue with internal and external stakeholders. And another example from Transport Scotland, very briefly, is Plastic Fantastic, as they call it, and this is looking at plastic sleepers for the rail. Now, traditional concrete sleepers, they do break down, they have to be replaced, they are very environmentally intensive. There's lots of obviously embodied carbon within concrete. And one of the biggest issues was, how do we make sure that we reduce the cost, reduce the environmental impact, but also make sure that there are the sleepers we use are safe, of course, that is the overriding consideration, and they meet the engineering standards that are required. And that's one of the key issues with circularity. There can sometimes be a concern if you end up with something that's refurbished or remanufactured or whatever, it's not fit for purpose. It's not going to meet your engineering or performance standards. That shouldn't be the case. Certainly if it's remanufactured, then it comes with a warranty equivalent to an original. If it's refurbished, then obviously you need to understand the extent of that. In this case, it was a question of looking at alternative materials, and it ended up with the engineering standards being adopted and applied and approved, and there's been significant improvement in the cost, in the embodied carbon, and also in terms of health and safety. And why? Because concrete weighs a lot, and there's a certain amount of manual labor involved, whereas these are much lighter. They're still at least as strong, and will last for at least as long as concrete, if not longer. And so it's a win-win all round, really. It's been a social improvement, a health and safety improvement, it's been environmental improvement and a cost improvement. And it's a lesson of how you can achieve your required standards if you think smart. Okay, so thank you for that. Quick whistle-stop tour through those points. Now I think, Mervyn, over to you to talk about tools and circular approaches.
Thank you very much, Phil, and good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the seminar. So as Phil said, I'm going to talk a little bit on the sustainable procurement tools and also around how to start thinking about embedding circular approaches into specifications. And we just had a really good example there with the sleepers. You know, it's the important bit there is about ensuring that the relevant performance-based standards are put in the specifications. So again, we talked yesterday a little bit about fairness and proportionality, is making sure that the specifications allow all the possible solutions that meet that specification to be considered within the evaluation of tenders, rather than being prescriptive and focusing on a specific type of gravel, for example, in terms of fill, or a specific material. If you're focusing on the performance-based specifications around the engineering properties, then if a secondary material is capable of meeting those specifications, then it should be able to be included. But starting off, if I can move forward. So I need to just take access of the screen. And sorry about this. Thank you. So hopefully you can see my screen now, and hopefully I can start to move it on. We talked a little bit about just introducing tools yesterday. Very conscious that the audience here is almost exclusively Scottish audience, but this webinar is available through the ProSoap project, which, as I mentioned yesterday, has partners in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Sweden, and in Norway, as well as in Scotland. So when we talk about tools, we are talking about a range of different tools. And again, a definition of what we call tool is quite a broad definition. And I'll go into that into a little more detail. But this focus initially starts on when and where you should use it. As you can see from the slide on the right-hand, the diagram on the right-hand side of the screen, if you look at the procurement process as a series of stages, as we mentioned yesterday, the area of greatest opportunity, and it's a sort of basic truth really, is in the pre-tender stage. That's the area where market engagement, where strategic alignment, and where planning typically take place. It's also the area where, again, a lot of tools are very useful in terms of applying and understanding what the options are. But tools essentially can be used throughout the procurement process, and therefore the nature of those tools will differ. As you can see in front of you, tools with common and consistent aims and approach and language, as we have in Scotland with the procurement tools that the higher education sector has, and also very similar to the procurement tools in the wider public sector within Scotland. And from a sustainability perspective, a key aspect of these tools is actually being able to forecast and understand what the potential benefits are, and also then understanding which and what stakeholders need to be involved. So what I'll do is I'll go through now and just show you what the ProSoap project has been doing within the sort of wider landscape of tools. Again, as I've said, the caveat here is recognizing that there are very good tools in Scotland, but also recognizing from feedback and from experience that many procurers and many organizations also have their own pet tools and also like to use other tools as and where available. So when we talk about types of tools, as I mentioned, there's a raft, a variety of tools that are available at the planning or the pre-tender stage that focus around ambition and planning. And by ambition, I'm meaning here, or we mean, I should say, in the ProSoap project, linking the outcomes of a procurement exercise into strategic goals, into strategic targets, and into strategic delivery. For example, the national framework, linking into the indicators as a sustainability test does within the procurement tools in Scotland. But there are also, again, if we think about tools as being broad in terms of the definition, there are also tools around capacity building. And particularly, as Phil's been saying, when we talk about circular procurement, when we talk about the circular economy, because it is more of a systemic approach, it requires more interaction and it requires more engagement with a wider range of stakeholders. So thinking about training opportunities, awareness raising and capacity building opportunities and various tools, and they can be as simple as providing case studies to evidence why it should be possible. It could be as simple in terms of capacity building as peer-to-peer peer-to-peer contact, through networks, etc., understanding what others are doing or have done on similar procurements, but also tools around priority and spend analysis, like the prioritization, the sustainability prioritization tool, and again around risk assessment, because again, risk assessment underlies a lot of the decisions that are made within the procurement process. The next set of tools around pre-tender, again, these are typically focused on developing KPIs, on engaging with market through market dialogue. For example, through, Phil mentioned the prior information notices, the PIN notices. That's a tool in its own way. There's also workshops that can be done in order to understand as well as to communicate what is available and what the organisation's ambitions are. But a key set of tools around the tools that we've looked at and assessed have been life cycle assessment tools. And again, if we're thinking about circular economy as an integrated systemic concept, and we're thinking about how procurement can help deliver that, it then becomes almost a given that the procurement has to think in some way, shape or form around life cycle impacts, whether that's impacts at cost, whether that's environmental impacts, whether it's social impacts, ideally impacts across all three of them. So tools like whole life costing tools then become quite important as well. But then we also have the design tools, and again, within particular sectors, design tools feature far more prominently than other tools. For example, within the construction and the infrastructure sectors, in Scotland and in elsewhere, there are a plethora, a large quantity of design tools available. And again, one of the examples that Phil mentioned with regard to the VNN bridge in the Netherlands, was the concept of material passports. So again, identifying the content, the quality, the ingredients and the structures of particular products and their components, so that that information can be taken forward throughout the utilization, the operation of that particular element, that particular component throughout its functional lifetime, which enables and helps in terms of repair, maintenance, and ultimately at end of life in terms of potential for not just remanufacture, but also for disassembly and for deconstruction and reuse and recycling, in terms of secondary materials. And all of that is quite important, because that then feeds all the way back into the comment that Phil made and I made at the start of my little section on the need for performance-based specifications. And that then enables the information to create a more of a level playing field between virgin materials and secondary materials. So design tools, and again, as you can see on the slide in front of you, training tools again, because building capacity is something that happens not just at the start of a procurement process or at the start of a particular project, but it's an ongoing, it's a continual improvement objective. Of course, when we get into specification, we get into criteria tools, and there's a variety of tools available around criteria. Functional questions are functional questions tools. Well, whatever, we're being broad, but there's plenty of templates in terms of ways of presenting specifications as well. And then, of course, award criteria, various different matrices, evaluation frameworks, and Phil will be talking a little bit more about these after this section. Weighting, very important, particularly when we're talking about most economically advantageous tendering and around the ratio between price and quality. How you look to include price, is that just initial capital cost, or as Phil was saying before, is it more about focusing price in terms of whole life costing? And then, of course, the bit that often gets left because it's right at the very end is contract performance. Contract performance improvement clauses as tools, and particularly when we're talking about performance, is about the reporting tools and reporting mechanisms that are in place. So a very long-winded way of saying there are tools available for all stages of the procurement cycle. And by the cycle, we mean pre-tender as well as tender and specification and award, and also post-award through contract management. And so the tools that we looked at, which were done via a survey through the ProSoap project, tendering tools, procurement lifecycle tools, and circular economy tools, these have all come from various different European sources, including UK sources. And it's not a definitive study in any sense of a word, but what we found was a significant degree of overlap, as this slide in front of you now shows. So a lot of tools relate to carbon. Some are broader project-based tools, but many of them relate to the carbon footprint specific materials. So there's an overlap there between materials and carbon. There's an overlap, a very strong overlap in terms of construction and carbon, again for obvious reasons, because of the mass and the volume of materials being used within construction projects, that the carbon footprinting of construction in pretty much any sector always comes up highest. And also in terms of spend, when we look at procurement, the spend in terms of construction always tends to come up highest. It's the same in the higher education sector, whether you're in Scotland, Wales, the wider UK or Europe. You know, in those top 10 high impact sustainability priority categories, construction in its various different forms, whether that's build, refurb or fit out and maintenance, is always up there, if not top in the top 4. But there's also, as you can see there, quite a lot of supply chain tools. And again, when we're talking about circular procurement and the potential to be assessing and selecting suppliers, whether through framework or whether directly, it's really important not just to understand what the actual bidder is offering, but also how they're managing their own supply chain. And this supply chain, value chain management is really strong in certain sectors, for example, in the ICT sector, and frankly, it's a lot weaker in other sectors. So, you know, again, applying the same principle to those sectors that are already practicing or applying good practice makes good sense across all the categories. The caveat there, of course, as Phil said, is making sure that, you know, the questions being asked are both specific to the subject matter, but also proportionate in terms of what you're asking. The link at the bottom of this particular slide shows a more detailed webinar on the ProCirc tools. But if you like, because this is being sponsored under the ProCirc project, that was the message from the sponsors. But you can access that toolbox, you can access the webinar around the tools as well, if you want to, by going to that link. So as I've mentioned, in Scotland, we have the sustainable procurement tools within the public sector, and also those which are more or less mirrored within the higher education sector. And the key tools we've picked out there are the prioritization tool. And if you're not familiar with the prioritization tool, you can have typically procurement focused prioritization tools which look at spend in particular categories. But what the prioritization tool within Scotland looks at in the context of sustainability is how those spend categories align with the environmental and social and sustainability issues that particular organizations have identified. So instead of just focusing on what is your highest spend category, it's a combination of what is your highest spend category alongside how do those categories impact on your sustainability goals that you've highlighted within your particular organization, for example, through strategies and through policies that you've published, but also how have they then impacted and affected by risk, you know, in terms of your organization. So there's that risk factor that comes back in, there's that impact factor alongside the spend factor. And clearly there is no one tool that meets everybody's needs. So again, it's understanding what the range of tools are available, just like when we go into the local DIY store, and what tools are fit for purpose in terms of what it is that we're trying to do. Again, a question at the bottom, just to try and get some interaction. Apologies, as this is a webinar, you can't actually speak, but what we would encourage you to do is to put into the chat, just contribute in the chat function, what type of procurement tools you're regularly using. Okay, so moving on in terms of from tools into developing a specification, so getting more now into the actual detail. We've made a lot in terms of functional questions and technical questions. One of the key bits before we even get into that is, as I've started to mention, is around the selection of suppliers. and particularly when you're talking around broader outcomes, policy-based outcomes around sustainability, understanding how your suppliers are acting is really quite important. So, again, whether it's through a framework or whether you're just trying to effectively set gateway criteria to selection of suppliers. For example, understanding how suppliers are going to help deliver specific targets that you've got, how they are matching in to your ambitions, to your policy goals and objectives. For example, on carbon, for example, on single-use packaging, on recycled content. And being specific there in supplier selection within the sustainability questions, for example, what are the suppliers doing themselves? What have they done? What evidence have they got? How are they engaging with their supply chains, and what innovations are they actually developing? One example here is again, the packaging sector, or the packaging as part of the overall delivery of a procurement has typically been just something that has been done without any conscious thought around it. But more and more within public procurement within Scotland, questions being asked around the types of packaging being used. Is that packaging capable of being recycled within the local infrastructure that's available within that particular part of Scotland? Because what can be recycled in one part isn't necessarily economically viable or potentially capable of being recycled in another. And it's not necessarily going to help anyone just by simply saying this is technically recyclable. That's a good starting point, but there's a lot more in terms of asking and evidencing what can be done with packaging beyond being technically recyclable. So is it currently being recycled? How is it being recycled? What innovations? And innovations, for example, particularly with regard to trying to reduce the amount of single-use packaging within various different areas, whether that's furniture delivery, whether it's in the delivery of ICT or in catering consumables in the food and catering sector, looking at substitution of materials, and in some cases, in many cases, actually looking at the ability to substitute single-use items with reusable items. Also looking at the availability of recycled content. Many different types of packaging already have recycled content in them to varying different degrees. Do your potential suppliers know what levels are currently in their packaging? And also, do they know what levels are technically capable of being put in there? And again, when you engage with the market and you start to ask these questions, typically not typically, in many cases, in most cases, they already know the answers. It's just we haven't in Scotland been asking those questions of our supply base. So it's really important to make sure that we're asking relevant questions, but we're asking specific questions. As you can see, the single procurement document, are the grounds for exclusion, etc., are the grounds for creating gateway criteria for enabling suppliers who might not be in a position to actually deliver now, but have got or are capable of putting in an action plan that allows that delivery to happen. And that's quite important, again, when we're thinking about procurement and also other objectives around supporting small, medium-sized enterprises, and so that we're not creating a distorted marketplace. We are enabling fair competition between the big guys and the smaller guys as well. So in terms of setting the specification, what's needed, the key stakeholders, again, this is something from those within the procurement function, where it's a case of having to go out and speak to the technical experts within the organization. But again, I would strongly recommend that that's a dialogue. It's not just simply devolving responsibility to them. It's again coming back to testing and challenging the need. Are there specifications that could be written in a different way? So again, instead of being prescriptive, could they be more performance-based? What are the intended outcomes? Again, that is a dialogue, because again, just simply getting a list of technical specifications from the technical experts doesn't necessarily help in terms of clarifying the intended outcomes, both to the procurers within the organisation to understand what is the best way then to present that in the tender, but also to the suppliers. So again, things like clarity in terms of intended outcomes can actually be tested earlier on in terms of market engagement, as can innovation. You know, again, looking at the capability and awareness of both Phil and I have been talking about earlier today and also yesterday. You know, this is the opportunity to understand what the market can actually deliver if you ask the right question. And then again, right there at the bottom, really important, can they be objectively measured? And Phil will be talking about this a little bit more. So the key bit in terms of objectively measured is not just in terms of the tender, in terms of tender evaluation, but also going forward. So what are the management and reporting systems that can be evidence that are in place in order to be able to enable that to be monitored during the contract period? And of course, that then links into the KPIs and links into obligations around reporting upwards through, as we showed yesterday with that golden thread, into the national framework indicators. Now, I've banged on quite a bit already about technical specifications and functional questions, etc., etc. The key bit here is that there is no right or wrong way. Performance-based specifications, functional specifications allow for a much broader answer and therefore have to be evaluated in a slightly different way. You know, it's not simply a yes, no. Technical specifications are specifications that will be met during the contract. So again, much more focused on yes, no type answers. Are they delivered? Are they not delivered? Can they be delivered? Can they not be delivered? Performance-based specifications, functional specifications are broader in terms of asking for more innovative solutions. For example, when we talk about transport, do you need 100 cars or do you need mobility? If we're talking about you know, a bridge, for example, in terms of infrastructure projects, do you need a connection between 2 points, A and B? They might be on one side of a road or on another. They might be on one side of a river or another. Or do you need a bridge? So, you know, again, it's a way that the question is asked that enables solutions or innovative solutions or more circular solutions to be offered from the marketplace. So as we considered yesterday in session 1, the diagram on the right hand side of the screen, and apologies, it is a little bit small, but as we saw yesterday, is a function of market maturity and product complexity. And again, it's only a rule of thumb, but the rule of thumb is that the more complex the product, the more function your question can typically be. So for example, in terms of medium complexity, we might be thinking something around furniture, you know, where you have many components made of multiple materials, but broadly based, similar sorts of materials, similar sorts of components. And you compare and contrast that in terms of complexity with a building where you have hundreds of thousands of different types of components and you've got a multitude of different materials. And again, when you're talking about market maturity, typically now the market in furniture and the market in construction is very mature in terms of its understanding of circularity and its understanding of the role that its products and its services can play in terms of circularity. So that maturity is a factor to be considered as well, because there's no point in setting functional questions if a marketplace is only able to deliver to technical. And again, that reinforces the point of understanding at what level the market is through market engagement prior to the setting of specifications. Down in the bottom hand corner, the bottom left hand corner, and I'm spotting a mistake here. that blue one should be the more immature or the less mature a market to be, the more technical your question can be. If only I'd checked this slide before I actually spoke to it. But yeah, so down in the bottom left-hand side, that's where you have less mature markets, if that's the right use of the English language, and you have lower product complexity. And examples there are examples like packaging, where you typically have single or dual material. You're not particularly complex products in either the way that they're formed or the way that they're used. So, you know, technical questions there are potentially more relevant. The key bit, again, when we're talking procurement, we're talking about specifications, is to ensure that they're clear. And again, I go back to market engagement. And a good way of ensuring that the market understands the type of specifications that you're going to ask is to make sure that you've tested those out with the market. But prescriptive frameworks can constrain innovation and circular outcomes. These are barriers, these are potential barriers. And a lot of the points on this particular slide, these points have been from feedback that we've got through tenders when we've undertaken tender exercises in Scotland, whether they're framework exercises or single tender exercises or competitive tender exercises. But frameworks, for example, they can be potentially valuable in terms of bringing together groups of customers, and also in terms of ensuring a more partnered arrangement with supply chains. But don't forget that they can potentially have disadvantages. So again, it's how you end up selecting your initial suppliers and also how you're going to monitor performance improvement within frameworks. Not considering life cycle costing, again, this is a common challenge, if you like, particularly from suppliers who like to offer more circular business models and believe that they are market leaders, market innovators in this, is that very often within the public sector at least, and I have less evidence from the higher education sector, but within the public sector, not considering life cycle costing as part of the tender exercise, so just focusing on the initial capital cost. So again, opportunities there. And the more life cycle costing that can be included, even if it's just thinking about impacts, even if it's just thinking about the maintenance costs or the disposal costs and factoring those in, those are ways of differentiating within price between a more sustainable and a less sustainable supplier. And again, going back to tools, there is a tool on the Scottish Government website there that enables that life cycle costing simple analysis to be done. Very, very easy and basic. It's on a spreadsheet. Inability to factor in use of existing stock. And again, this is a common one. Again, when we come back to technical specifications or prescriptive specifications, it leads suppliers into a single solution of delivering new compared to a functional specification, which may then bring in the opportunity to allow refurbished or reused items to be considered. Same with furniture. Again, Phil mentioned the Public Health Wales example. You know, that was focused very much on the opportunity to use the existing furniture. And again, that has to be written into the tender in a way that is clear to the potential bidders. And a best price quality ratio, and Phil's going to go on about this next, so I'm not going to steal his thunder on that one. Measuring the wrong things, again, when we're looking at, particularly in terms of evaluation, is ensuring that the evaluation scoring matches the questions that we're asking within the tender and the specification. And as you can see, framework managers and users to make sure that there has been at least a dialogue in the longer term contracts or the more higher spend contracts, to make sure that the users are engaged, and also where relevant, waste management are engaged to understand what the consequences are of the procurement decisions further down the line, because ultimately the organisation pays for it, whether it's upfront, during the cost of operation, or at end of life. And yeah, here's some typical examples. This is a European one, the Dutch Ministry of Defence. Again, the Dutch government has got an ambition to be fully circular by 2050. It's doing this, and it started doing this in 2014, not ultimately and primarily because of an environmental benefit, but because it recognized that there were economic benefits. And it also recognized that as a small country, it imported 60% of the stuff that it used within the wider economy, and typically even more of the stuff it used within the public sector. Uniforms were one of those. And again, in terms of waste management, recognition that there was a high degree of waste in terms of materials, uniforms, corporate wear, workwear going into landfill and also going into incineration. So what they looked at doing was piloting the potential to actually recycle and ultimately to have 100% recycled fibre in their uniforms. Going back to risk, clearly risk in uniforms of recycled fibres is quite a high risk type approach. So they tested it out in terms of procuring towels and workwear and overalls first. But they have now got recycled content in their military uniforms, the highest grade technical textile fibres you can probably get in terms of workwear alongside health and safety. And they're now looking to move forward to increase that level of recycled content. Will they get to 100% recycled uniforms? That's debatable. They've done it in a pilot exercise. Clearly it's not cost effective at the moment. They have to go out to Italy to actually enable that to happen. And it's incredibly expensive. But again, it's proving the concept. And what it has done is by focusing on that ambition has meant, as you see here in the slide, that the toweling and the overalls now are routinely specifying recycled content in terms of fibres, and that the marketplace can routinely deliver that. So it's that innovation that's dragging forward and pulling through basic standard and good practice behind it in other areas. The lessons learned, and again, this is key in terms of what I've just been saying, is that the original requirements that they put into their tenders included too many technical specifications. So again, they started to move to more functional questions once they'd engaged with the marketplace and the marketplace understood what it was that they were looking for. Again, it's important to recognize when we're talking about tools and when we're talking about specifications, the role that both standards play, and also of labeling, eco labels, type 1 eco labels, type 2 eco labels, and so on. And we have the government buying standards. We've got the green public procurement criteria from the European Commission. There's levels of mandatory requirements on some of these. GPP is purely voluntary, but as an outsider, I would point out that the GPP is also far more regularly updated in terms of the selection, and it's also more relevant in terms of what the market can deliver now compared to necessarily what it could deliver back in 2012 or 13 or 14 or 15, because we've had such big advances. Type 1 eco labels, hopefully most of you, if not all of you, are going to be familiar with these, but these are third-party accredited labels. And again, there are strengths and weaknesses with that in terms of type 1 eco labels cost. But so inevitably there's a cost borne by somebody within the supply chain, if not by the customer. But the benefits of them, of course, is that they have very, very definable and clear standards, and very often the supply chain is aware of those standards and working towards those standards or delivering those standards as a result. So again, if you know that the majority of the marketplace is doing it, setting those as gateway standards, is something to consider. So what we'd like to do now to just break it up a little bit and go back to the poll is just to ask a few questions now in terms of standards. So if we could have the poll up. So question number 1, how often do you use the GPP criteria? Is that always, frequently, sometimes, or never? And then question 2, how often do you use eco labels? We'll give you a little bit of time in terms of answering those. About 2/3 of the responses so far. Seems to be settling down. Just give it a few more seconds because I think it seems to be sort of settling down a little bit. So if we can, if anybody hasn't responded, it'd be great if you could participate. But I think we're just about there. Seconds more, any more for any more? Okay, so let's end the polling and show the results. So some quite interesting results there in terms of both GPP criteria and also eco labels. I don't have shares in green public procurement. However, what I would advocate is that where you're using government buying standards, please look at the green public procurement criteria as well, and do a quick compare and contrast to look at whether there are opportunities to set higher standards. Green public procurement criteria have both core and comprehensive, so you've got 2 different levels there in terms of what you can use, and there's a broad range covering over 20 different product groups on the EU website. In terms of eco labels, you know, again, I haven't got the ability to unpack the question, but obviously eco labels can be applied in some areas far more liberally and easily than others. So yeah, it would be interesting if you do have any examples of where you're using eco labels, please just let us know in the chat. That would be quite useful. But again, a lot of people not using eco labels. It would be interesting to know why not, without leading you on in terms of particular answers to that question. If you're not using eco labels and you've considered them, but there's a specific barrier, then please let us know in the chat and we'll pick that up in the discussion. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much for contributing to that. I'm going to gloss over this one now because normally we'd be able to sort of have a good discussion around this in terms of example procurements and looking at a scope of the contract, whether it should be a technical specification or a functional specification, and contract management. And Phil now is going to go into a little bit more in terms of evaluation and contract management anyway. So I'm going to just now pass the slides back over to Phil. Thanks, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Mervyn. Okay, I'm actually just going to share my screen. Okay, right, thanks very much for that, Mervyn. Right, evaluation and awards. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but it's worth reinforcing some of the key points. As Mervyn mentioned, best price quality ratio, we need to think about weightings. Now, why is that relevant? Because when it comes to a circular approach to procurement, we need to think about to what extent is this core to the contract in question? Is it an important element? How important is it? Or is it a bit of an ancillary or peripheral issue? Because that must be reflected in weightings. Now, how you use price quality weightings is obviously varies within public sector and the education sector to some extent. But at the end of the day, it's obviously good practice that the weightings must apply the nature and the extent of the risks. Quality tends to include the sustainability issues and the sorts of issues we're talking about. And quite often you'll have a discrete section, obviously, on sustainability. In my utopian world, perhaps I'm quite of the view that it would be nice to have it all threaded through the specific quality service delivery requirements rather than having it as a separate section. But that's perhaps a subject for another discussion at some other time. I mentioned the example of NHS Scotland and their weighting of 25%. Now that reflected the particularly important focus in that particular category because it was furniture and because there are a lot of opportunities for circularity when it comes to furniture. Then it was, and because it reflected the policy and the ambition of NHS Scotland, then that was reflected in the weighting. So you need to make sure that the weighting is reflective, is of course relevant and proportionate. We have also spoken at times about how the circular approach can deliver financial benefits, economic benefits. So it's also worth bearing in mind that some of the focus on reducing waste, reducing material use, virgin material use, that could have a knock-on financial impact, which would potentially be reflected in the commercial parts of the evaluation. You also need to think, of course, do you know what a good response looks like? There's no point doing an evaluation of a tender if you don't really know what you're looking for. So you need to have a clear understanding when you're developing the specification, not when you're thinking about the evaluation, but when you're developing the specification, how's it going to be evaluated, what the evaluation criteria are, and what should a good response look like. And an example is one here. This is taken from some guidance that exists. This is not an example that would be provided to the market, but it's just for guidance. So we're saying an ideal response would set out how an organization will practically apply the waste hierarchy in service delivery. We've said that the waste hierarchy and the circular economy are very much aligned. It's not all about waste, of course, but it is an important element. And that includes how the organization has assessed, prioritized, how have they focused effort, where are they focusing effort, how have they identified priorities to reduce waste, to reduce the use of virgin materials, taking into account any cost, functional, technical performance requirements, okay? And for example, including use of materials that contain recycled content and those that would otherwise be treated as waste. So that's understanding so that when you get a tender, you know, that's what I'm looking for. These are the key words, these are key outcomes I'm looking for. The other critical element to all of this is making sure you know what you need to monitor. How are you going to manage this through contract management? Now, we know that contract management, there can sometimes be issues in it being an under-resourced area in the procurement cycle, but it is absolutely critical to be able to identify whether your intended outcomes are being delivered or not. Do you need to have further conversation with the supplier? Are there opportunities to have conversations with the supplier about continual improvement? Okay, that is not necessarily a contract condition. That is more about voluntary discussion and dialogue to try and encourage further improvement, but there's still that opportunity to be had. When it comes to contract conditions, again, we need to think about what is relevant and what is proportionate according to the intended outcomes that we have. And those will be monitored and measured through some sets of KPIs. And KPIs obviously vary in their nature. They may relate to products, for example. And if we have set particular types of products which meet particular standards, such as those that Mervyn has just spoken about, we may need ongoing verification that they are meeting those standards as part of the KPI. And some of the verification potentially relates to the circularity. If the standards that are being applied to those products include circular outcomes, such as those that Mervyn mentioned, then we need ongoing verification. There may also be KPIs that relate to process. And that may relate to how the supplier is working with the supply chain on enhancing circular procurement, circular approaches through the supply chain. It may also be something about you as an organization, that you can identify what you are doing regarding circular procurement. But from a contract management perspective, it's trying to identify what process change, what process improvements are taking place in the delivery of the contract or the framework. There are also, of course, output KPIs, and these are what specific impacts are being affected, what outcomes are being delivered, be they environmental, economic, and of course circularity, which is what we're talking about. So they could be specific outputs, specific reduction in waste, specific reduction in use of virgin materials, the reuse of materials, products, or assets, for example. And of course, with contract management, as I say, you have to be relevant and proportionate. You don't want to create some massive long shopping list of requirements which suppliers are going to find too onerous to report against. So identify the core requirements that you need. Again, it comes back to what we were talking yesterday about: be clear about what your ambitions are. How are those ambitions reflected in the requirements in the tender in a relevant, proportionate way? And how are they then reflected in the contract management requirements? So in terms of KPIs, I'll just put these all up, I think. Some examples. So from a sourcing perspective, if the objective is to try and reduce the total amount of materials being used, so there may be KPIs about the material use. Okay, if that's, for example, a construction project, has material use being avoided, and what is that in terms of carbon dioxide reduction, and potentially also in cost savings. Reducing the amount of virgin materials, again, that can form part of a KPI. It could also therefore reflect to the recycled content within the products or the materials, assets being procured or being used. Again, at the use phase, so what materials or products are being diverted from landfill. Obviously, there's a link here from use to the end of life, but it's still relevant at use phase. What products reaching the end of life are then repaired? So how are we extending their useful life for the repair, the refurbishment, reconditioning, etc.? And is there any remanufacturing that's taking place? Are we using products, for example, that are remanufactured? What percentage of products being supplied come from remanufactured sources which meet our required performance, quality, warranty requirements? And then at the end of the life, KPIs, for example, about the what the percentage is, the proportion, the value of products, components that are being reused. That may include being donated or resold. How much waste is being reused as a result, how much waste is being diverted from landfill, and again, any cost savings. So there's various KPIs that would potentially apply, again, according to the subject matter of the contract and according to what your ambitions are and what is relevant. The contract performance clauses, of course, will include various things. It may include, as this slide talks about, packaging. It may include how waste is managed and recycling and is undertaken. It may include the supply chain management and the responsibility of the main contractor and subcontractors, because you need to make sure that this is cascaded through the supply chain. And that is one thing with a circular approach to procurement, is making sure that if you've got large contractors involved, how are they cascading lessons? How are they cascading the approach and the requirements down their supply chain? And that may well be something that you need to monitor through contract management. How can they demonstrate what the supply chain looks like? and what approaches do they take, what capability and capacity building is taking place within their supply chain to enable that supply chain to be more circular. And of course, as we've said, the contract performance clauses must be linked to the subject matter of the contract, and of course, again, must be advertised in advance. Now, there's an example here. Now, this particular example is one, there's a lot of words here. I realize that you probably won't want to read all of this, but it's worth putting it up because this is it's an extract from a particular contract for a hard FM contract, hard facilities management contract. And it's trying to highlight the link from specification, which Mervyn was talking about, to potential contract management requirements. So we have a range of objectives here, if you like. Now, this is just an extract. This isn't the full specification, but it's just an extract. So the contractor is required to support the client's aims to transition to a circular economy, keep up to date with best practice. So you're looking for, in this case, the contractor, the supplier, to be somebody who is keeping on top of what the opportunities are regarding circular approach, circular procurement, circular supply within the FM and related sector. And to work with the client to identify those opportunities and to implement them where practical, making sure that they align with value for money and cost certainty. Okay, so you're setting out a clear message, if you like, to the market about how important circular approaches are to you, how important is this to value for money. Okay, and then you have specific measures that may need to be monitored. So that's where the link is to contract management. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but in the case of a hard FM contract, when of course you are potentially, depending on the scope of the contract, but you're potentially using materials, you're using equipment, you're using tools, you're using transportation, you're bringing people on site, there's potentially waste being generated. You may be repairing, refurbishing, as well as installing new equipment or fittings. There's a whole range of different issues that could potentially apply when it comes to circularity. So we want to make sure that any equipment, tools, plant, products, etc., used or installed are is their life being extended as much as possible. What we don't want is any equipment being installed that is going to need to be replaced quickly. We want equipment that is designed for non-obsolescence, which is referenced later in the list. And we also want the organization, the supplier, to be operating a circular approach so that when they're using plant and equipment or tools in their hard FM, how do they make sure that they're extending their useful life so they're not being wasteful in their use? There are reputational issues here as well as environmental issues. You want to work with suppliers who are supporting your objectives, of course. And it may also include going down the list a bit more in terms of repairing, reusing, redeploying, refurbishing. So all the re's relating to otherwise redundant equipment, products, plant, etc. So if part of the hard FM service is working to replace equipment, fittings, etc. Now, is there an opportunity to take a more circular approach? So can they actually be repaired? So we want them to go through this hierarchy approach to determine what opportunities there are. So the default is, no, we're not going to replace them unless we really, really have to. We're going to repair them where possible, refurbish them where possible, assuming that is a cost-effective solution. Otherwise, using reclaimed, refurbished, remanufactured products, equipment, which meet your performance standards, of course, and they must do. We're not saying that you use products or equipment that are not going to meet those standards. They must meet those standards. So you need to set that out very clearly, and you may need to set out specific standards that you have to meet and make sure you get evidence of that and ongoing evidence of that through contract management. Use of materials for high levels of recycled content. Okay, they may say in their tender, yes, we can do that. We can provide materials which have 20% or 60% recycled content. You may well need to continue to monitor that to ensure that they're meeting your objectives. Use of low impact embodied carbon materials. Increasingly, there is data available. I wouldn't say it's routinely available, but increasingly there are products and materials where the amount of carbon, embodied carbon within them is available, and you may be asking for evidence of how that is being minimized. And again, you want ongoing evidence of that. And there may be opportunities for continual improvement. Use of durable materials and systems. In this case, we're talking about anything that may relate to hard FM. So we've got inclusion of aggregates, insulation, metals, concrete, composites, plasterboard, timber, plastics, glass, etc. There'll be others as well. But again, all of those meeting performance and quality requirements, excuse me, making sure that they are durable, making sure they're meeting your requirements. And we mentioned obsolescence, that's the next point, and spare parts being available, so useful life may be optimized, minimized, and waste in accordance with waste hierarchy, etc. So you are, the final point about alternative service models, well, that may link back to some of the use of equipment or tools. What you don't want to find out somehow is that your supplier is buying equipment just to do a one-off job, or some tools just to do a one-off job for you, and then that tool is going to end up as waste. Why don't they hire the tool instead, or rent the tool, which they should be able to do so? If the hard FM service gets involved in areas like more hard construction type work, because there's an element of refurbishment involved, then you may get involved in thinking about the plant they're using, and whether that plant could be electric plant, which is increasingly available now, for example. So there's potentially a long list of things there for that particular example, and that is obviously a specific type of example. It's for hard FM. But you'll see that when it comes to contract management, because you've got quite a long list of issues, and a number of them are going to need to be monitored during contract management. Otherwise, you're not going to be clear whether the organisation is delivering your objectives and requirements or not. Sorry, just jumping around a bit. Okay, so we've got a bit of a poll here, another poll if we can. So what I'd like you to do is, I've mentioned some KPIs, and then if you could just answer a quick question on KPIs, which the poll will come up now. This is asking you about the specific KPIs. You need to scroll down because there's a few questions for this. So do you set sustainability KPIs within contracts? Do you use sustainability KPIs in supplier performance? Are they routinely reported by suppliers? And are contract sustainability KPIs monitored by your organization as part of overall impacts? So the last question is about what do you do with the results that you identify? So if you wouldn't mind just doing a quick vote on that poll. Give you a minute or so just to do that. While you're doing that, I just remind you, if you've got any questions, then please fire them into chat. We'll be having a short session at the end, just trying to look at any questions and a discussion point when we round up. So please feel free to fire questions across, or indeed any comments or suggestions. Okay, almost there. I think in the interest of time, we'll probably stop to it there. There's one or two coming in. Okay, right. So in terms of outcomes, do you set sustainability KPIs within contracts? Well, majority, yes, but always depends. Yeah, well, that's a reasonable response. Of course, it depends on the nature of the contract and the subject matter of the contract. Do you use sustainability KPIs in supplier performance? Again, sometimes, interestingly, 14% never. Okay, interesting. Depends on the nature of the contract again. Are they routinely reported by suppliers? Not always. Okay, so be interesting to understand from you where that answer comes from. Is it because you're not asking them to report it? Is it because they're not routinely reporting it as part of contract requirements? Is that a particular issue you've got? And finally, are contract KPIs monitored as part of overall impacts? Okay, is a broad split, an equal split between yes and don't know. So that's really the question about what do you do with outcomes from contract management? Are they then used to demonstrate how procurement and procurement generally is supporting your objectives as an organization, but also wider objectives, be they the National Performance Framework, national outcomes, and UN SDGs, for example. So implication perhaps from that response is that there's a mixed views on that, a mixed approach. Okay, thanks very much for that. Just quickly, in the interest of time, I'd mentioned continual improvement. There's always the opportunity to work with suppliers, to encourage them to have a dialogue, whether there's the opportunity for further improvement on a voluntary way when you're talking about contract management. And there's also the opportunity to encourage suppliers to improve. The CO2 performance ladder is one that has been used in Europe and has actually been used to within tenders. It is 5 levels to it, and it identifies what the suppliers are doing regarding reducing carbon within their organization, and it is being used to provide as part of a tender exercise to differentiate to some extent between tenders as part of that process. Now, we're not saying you have to use that. It's another example of what's been going on, particularly in Europe, to try and encourage suppliers to improve. And part of that is about dialogue with the market. Part of that is about making sure you clearly articulate to the market what your ambitions are, what your direction of travel is, and how you want them to support that. Excuse me. So again, this makes the point about what do you do with contract management. So there will be reporting requirements that we have in the education and public sector. There will be internal reporting requirements, for example, there's the climate change reporting requirements, and there's the increasing focus on that and the expectation that there will be an increasing focus because of net zero, because of the climate change emergency and the importance of that agenda. And that was emphasized in the e-learning I mentioned yesterday regarding climate and the role of procurers. the Scottish Government e-learning available on the Scottish Procurement tools. So have a look at that. That reinforces that message. So expect more scrutiny regarding that going forward. So we need to be able to demonstrate how procurement is supporting the climate change agenda, how it is supporting the transition to net zero. And as we said yesterday, excuse me, a circular approach is one very important part of that. We also need to identify, and their reporting requirements, of course, how procurement contributes to national outcomes and SDGs. So it's shown that golden thread, which Mervyn went through yesterday. And of course, as organisations obligated by public contract regulations, we have annual procurement reports, and we need to identify how procurement is supporting our intended objectives. So we need to take that thread from the specification, being clear what's relevant, proportionate from a circular perspective, monitoring through contract management in a relevant, proportionate way, and then taking the lessons from that and showing how procurement, specific procurement, and generally is supporting those objectives. That is an essential and important lesson. Final slide on this section talks about an example, again, a Dutch example, talks about metering. Won't spend too long on about it, but this is just showing the how the outcomes have been identified through monitoring what's taking place, looking at the reduction in material used, the recycled content, reduction in embodied carbon effectively as well, of course, would apply. And it's just an example of how you've got to be able to come up with these sorts of outcomes if we're doing this properly. Now, we recognise that in some cases, data baselines can be an issue. And again, this is mentioned in the climate literacy module. So we need to be relevant, we need to be realistic about what we can measure and monitor, but we therefore need to spend the time at the beginning when we're developing the specification to be able to identify what we can actively monitor and report. Okay, right, in the last 15 minutes or so, we will see whether we have any questions or so that we can respond to, and also wrap up on some key points. So, Mervyn, anything cropped up from what you've seen?
Just a couple of things when we asked for examples on shared platforms, if you like. Glasgow University, Stephen came back and mentioned the fact that one of the areas where typically shared utilisation can make good economic sense are in very high value, complex and specific pieces of equipment. Not everybody is necessarily going to need a nuclear reactor like the University of Glasgow has, but it could be things, for example, in terms of laboratory equipment, scanners in particular, those sorts of areas. But no, if you have got any questions, please put them into the chat. Otherwise, for those of you who saw yesterday, it just ends up being a talking heads between Phil and myself. So it'd be great to get some comments and some feedback. Yeah, what challenges, what barriers are you actually coming across in terms of some of the responses that you've put into the polls? One of the things I noted, with regard to the fairly large, significant number of people who said they don't know, I mean, that could be a result of the fact that there is usually a different person between the procurement and the contract management parts of a particular contract. So it's not necessarily the procurement function that's always going to be the function that takes on the reporting responsibilities. But the critical bit in terms of learning lessons is feeding that back when you come back to do that or a similar tender exercise in the future. And an example I'll say from the public sector within the wider UK, somewhere south of the border, if you're going between, for example, implementation and rollout phases of broadband, it's useful to know how phase 1 performed in order to be able to set the KPIs for phase 2. it doesn't matter that those KPIs were put into the contract, they need to be reported on. And if they're not reported on, then there's a problem there.
Okay, Mervyn, we've got a question in from Fergal. Thank you very much, Fergal. How do we change IT mindsets away from replacement to upgrade of equipment? Which is obviously very much a subject of the ICT webinar that took place recently. Thanks for that, Fergal. Good question. I think it's partly for colleagues, I think, to think about the answer, but it's perhaps partly about making sure we understand about performance and quality. There is sometimes a perception that if we upgrade or we replace with remanufactured or whatever, that is poor quality, and we're not going to get that. Increasingly with the ICT market, there is no reason why you shouldn't upgrade, you shouldn't refresh as your first default rather than replace. I think there are lots of reasons perhaps why replacement takes place. Sometimes it comes down to budgets and the age-old problem of capital and revenue budgets and the public sector financial model, where come the end of the financial year, you've got money left in your budget and you've got to spend it, otherwise you lose it. You know, the usual problem. And ICT has been one of those categories, and perhaps in the past furniture as well, maybe less so nowadays, but certainly ICT is one of those categories where that has been the case, where we'll buy some ICT to spend our budget, otherwise we're going to lose it. Now, that's not something we can necessarily solve easily now, but it does need an enlightened finance manager, somebody who's prepared to understand the issue and the challenge and to resolve it. And I think it also comes down to performance. But Mervyn, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, no, I only say it links through to what somebody put in the chat, that everything should go through procurement as part of compliant spend. Let's be honest, within the academic sector and higher education sector in particular, you know, there is a lot of devolved responsibility within procurement budgets between central functions and also the departments. You know, we see this throughout universities and higher education colleges throughout the UK. A lot of spending on P cards, a lot of spending on you know, business cards. So even where spending does go through the central function, you know, again, I've got examples where there were, you know, in the waste management department, everybody should have gone to them to get the right bin. I ended up doing a waste audit of one university and counted over 30 different types of bin. It was nearer to 40 different types of bin. That's because different individual departments were going out. So instead of using the recycling bins that were being rolled out across the university estate, they were just putting bins underneath their own desks where the bins have been taken away to encourage people to recycle more. So, you know, it's about behavior. It's about behavior change and practice, which, you know, is always an ongoing point. And it's, again, that's not just down to the people who do the purchasing, that's down to the users as well. You know, again, Uni Green scheme, that was an organisation set up for the valorisation of residual value of IT assets and laboratory instruments. That did it off the back of the very point that Phil made in terms of people spending on equipment that was either very rarely utilised or actually in some cases not even taken out of the boxes, just simply because they had to spend their budget. So yeah, there are structural failures within the financial systems, not just in higher education or in the public sector, but widely in organisations, full stop. One other example I did put into the chat was that very point about replacement or refurbishment rather than replacement, and actually the UK Ministry of Defence, again in discussion with suppliers and potential suppliers, opted to upgrade particular components in over 130,000 devices for IT, rather than buy new. That's not a case study that's published anywhere. That was just something that came out of discussions when we were talking about the wider UK strategy for ICT that was published last year. Yeah, again, but it's a very good example of being able to have a partnered arrangement with suppliers and to understand what they're capable of doing, because that actually came from the supplier as an option rather than buying new. So the supplier put that to the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence went away, did their due diligence or whatever they do in terms of, you know, capability, and they accepted that solution. So, you know, again, ask those questions, allow the market to come back with broader solutions rather than being prescriptive.
Okay, 5 minutes left, so I think it's just worth reiterating the call to action, if you like, reinforcing some of the key points. Some of this we looked through yesterday, but what are we saying? Make sure you understand what your ambitions are regarding circular approaches to procurement. We spoke about this yesterday. Do you want to be transformational? Are you going to try this out, test this out, focus on a specific issue, whether that is reuse, recycled content, one of the re's. Make sure that there is discussion early enough internally and with the market to understand what is possible and to understand so that everyone is supportive. You've got considerations of budgets when it needs to be, you've got consideration of outcomes when it needs to be, you've got consideration of contract management, as we said, as Mervin's just said, within the education sector, potentially a lot of devolved procurement takes place, so you need to get the support. And okay, we understand sometimes there can be issues with getting the support of some stakeholders within the education sector, but do what you can. Market engagement, critical element to this. Going back to what Mervin introduced yesterday, the 8-stage approach to circular procurement and the guide that's available, and the fact that 5 of those stages are pre-tender. So the earliest you do this, the better. That's where you're going to get the majority of the outcomes, the majority of the benefits, if you get it right at the beginning. Okay, so are there opportunities for pilots? Think about their complexity, think about the spend, what impacts are there, and the market maturity. So do you have a support base for this? You know, as we discussed, is there support at a high level? Is there support by the relevant stakeholders? Are you clear whether the market is ready for what you're seeking, or do you need to have that discussion with the market? The example I mentioned yesterday about unmet need, there may be an unmet need that's there, and you need to have a market discussion with the market to see whether they come up with a solution. Okay, so is this being considered as part of business case? Can you scale this up, etc.? So, and this sharing ideas, there's lots of this that is already taking place. There's lots of this that is evolving. There's lots of this that is still in its embryonic stages. So we need to be talking to each other. We need to be sharing good practice. We tried to share some examples with you, some case studies. There are many others in some sectors. We don't have the time to go through all those now, of course, but happy to talk later if that would be of help. Otherwise, resources, there's a few resources here which you may well find useful. We will be providing, as we've mentioned, the slides and also the slides for the ICT webinar and the recordings, so you can have a look at that. And I think final thing I need to say, or we need to say before we go, apart from thank you, of course, is that when you do leave us, you will be asked to do a quick evaluation. So please do that before you finally disappear. Otherwise, thank you very much. Unless there's any final points or queries, thanks very much from me and thanks very much from him. And hope you found it useful and enjoyable. We have, and good luck with your circular journey.
Yeah, thanks everyone.